Thanks for joining us today. I'm Mike Lessiter. I'm the editor and publisher of Farm Equipment Magazine. And today we have a very special guest with us, Willie Vogt, who was at the ship of this thing long before Lessiter Media got their hands on it. And we wanted to go back in time and talk to Willie about some of these memories that he had and how it cut his teeth here and led to a very illustrious publishing career. I guess, Willie, maybe before we get going, if there is any of our listeners or viewers out there who don't know who Willie Vogt is, the legendary career you've had, can you summarize a little bit for us what took place after you left Iowa State and where you are now as a recent retiree?
Yeah, recently retired. So I left Iowa State, went to work at a weekly farm paper. Second job was at an agency in Milwaukee, and then an opportunity opened up at what was Johnson Hill Press at the time. So farm equipment, Johnson Hill Press was my third job out of college. And I didn't start there at the farm equipment. And after that, I went on and did some other publishing freelance in the early 90s, which included coming back to farm equipment, which we'll talk about today. And then the last thing is I ended up at Farm Progress in 1996 as the technology editor and senior editor of Farm Futures. And I never looked back. I ended up becoming editorial director, but I never let go of covering ag technology and machinery. And that's because of farm equipment. I fell in love with equipment when I was at Farm Equipment, the business, the distribution, the people, short liners, long lines, all that stuff. I cut my teeth on that at Farm Equipment and learned an awful lot. And then when I came back into the farmer's side at Farm Progress, that was very valuable because the best story I could tell is I was on the company maybe a month and I ended up at a sales meeting. And half these sales guys are talking about different clients, and I knew all the clients. And they're like, how does this kid know all these companies? That's because I'd worked with most of them at Farm Equipment and also in freelance in the early 90s. So it was kind of fun, but Farm Equipment was a great real starting point for me. It was a job I really enjoyed.
Good. Well, Willie, I got a couple memories that you helped me with that I wanted to mention while we were on the call today. The first time, I know you've known my dad a long time, Frank Lessiter.
But so's everybody. So that's a different issue.
Well, I remember we bought farm equipment in the summer of 2004, and I was going on a press event up to New Holland in Fargo, and my dad said, you will see a guy by the name of Willie Vogt there. Go buy him a drink, get to know him because he's going to help you out. And I had 8-9 days under my belt with this thing at that point, and that's exactly what happened. I remember that you were helpful. You were giving me advice right from the get-go. And I don't know if you remember that or not, but it was meaningful to me at the time.
Well, I appreciate it. No, I mean, I always wanted to see farm equipment succeed. And there were some issues when I was there in some part of the history where there was some debate over its survival and what it should do. So when you guys captured it and brought it into the Lessiter family, I knew you would invest in it. And that made a big difference because all the things that were going on at Johnson Hill and then Cygnus, that wasn't a priority. Not a bad thing to the people who were managers then. Those were choices that they made, but then you guys bought it, and where you've gone with it has been exciting. I mean, the different products that you created, what's going on in the book, the video, the different multimedia. It's been fun to watch. And as somebody who was there at technically the beginning, I wasn't there 55 years ago. The book was something else when I came on board, but it's been exciting to see what Lessiter's done with it. And that's been cool especially in the last decade, as everything's really cinched up tight on the multimedia and your involvement in all the shows and to travel you guys are doing. It's great.
Yeah. We've had a few good times over the years too, out at Goodyear, Arizona. And then we were the 1-2 punch in Italy, cutting through the BS that was being served out there at times. You remember that, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we've had situations where the only two companies that were at an event, I believe it was the launch of the Vermeer self-propelled round baler, was only Farm Equipment and Farm Progress. Now, I wasn't able to attend, but we were the only publishers at the time that were even allowed to see that before anybody else. So that's about status in the industry too. So definitely.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk about you now. I mean, we go back to that initial interview, and they were trying to change. Johnson Hill was going to change what farm equipment was all about, right? So
I have to go farther back than that because I wasn't at farm equipment when I first came to Johnson Hill. When I went to Johnson Hill, I went over to the custom publishing side. I worked on the Deal of Al publication. I worked on Checkerboard newsletter for Purina. We worked on different projects, different custom publishing projects, Farm Credits magazine. So we were doing a lot of that kind of thing. These were the halcyon days. We had a plane. We'd go out in an airplane with 3 or 4 editors and drop us off and then pick us up and go on to somewhere else, and it was kind of an interesting time. But also things were changing. They had those trade publications and they were all just new product pubs. Essentially, Butch Horn, A.D. Horn, who was the editor of Farm Equipment, I think he was editor of like 3 other ones. All he did was take releases, edit releases, get the pictures scanned. And it was an important job because a lot of people in those industries want to know what's new. But there was a sudden feeling that this market needed products that were doing more. Rental, Pro, they were all just new product brochures, basically. And they decided they needed editors. So I was the first editor of Farm Equipment when they wanted to go toward go interview people, do content.
So I didn't realize you were working in another division at that time.
Yeah.
They brought you over and they said, we want to be a real industry pub. Would that be essentially how the interview went?
Yep. Yeah, that's basically, it wasn't so much an interview. Mike Martin was involved with that at the time. And then Jim Rank, and we talked about what it needed to be. Rich Reif, I think, was coming in at that time, even back then. Yeah. The timing, it's been, good Lord, man, it was 85. It's been a long time. But we started having meetings. I was meeting with key people at Massey Ferguson. I ended up going my very first European trip was that December of 85 when I went to Smithfield show with Massey Ferguson and did a big tour. And that was a lot of fun. So that got me in international travel, a thing that you don't think you'll ever do when you're studying journalism at Iowa State. You're going to end up traveling all over the places I ended up going. But it was an interesting conversation because they're like, we need to do something different. We need to do something important in this market. So the first thing was to just start covering things in depth. Whether it was a new piece of equipment, Case brought out the red version. They introduced, let's go back. This is 85. There was Tenneco had just bought the farm remains of IH, and they introduced the first red tractor, and it was essentially a red Case tractor. It was what it was, the 95 series. And then they were looking at bringing out the Magnum. So I got to go to that launch when the Magnum was launched the following year, which was a big deal. When the first Case IH tractor. So that was kind of fun. So I got to go to a lot of launches, and that started with Farm Equipment.
How did the subscriber base react to this big market change from what Farm Equipment had been to what you were hired to come in and do?
It's interesting because obviously there were other dealer publications out there. And so what we strive to do is hit things that weren't being hit. And no offense to the competition, but the other thing I was thinking about all this, I kind of forgot this a little bit. 1985, I want you to look at 1985. The average farm equipment dealer back then had 40 to 70,000 parts numbers in the bin, in the back. Mike, none of them were computerized. Few were. So in 85, part of the job was to start visiting dealers and walk through the process of how do you computerize a dealership? How is Bill Kibble doing it? Or how is somebody else doing it in different parts of the country? What is this thing doing? And what's going on in Center Alabama? And how do we think about parts? And it wasn't just computerizing, but learning some of the people that knew stuff off the top of their heads and how they were going to capture that expertise. I mean, we were talking about, I think we profiled different dealers using different systems to talk about how they worked, and just to get around the concept of digitizing a dealership was fascinating. So that was the first part of this. Was in those days that was big, and those conversations were amazing back then. To just talk to those dealers and say, learn about their business, but also they were learning about the business because they found all kinds of surprises.
Yeah, well, that's an article we've never had to write in my 20 years. We never had to write an article on why you should move to a computer-based system, right? But you were doing that back in the early days. So.
Yeah, it's so much should, but how to steps, thinking about it, how Fred's doing it and how Jimmy was doing it, just to do the examples. It was more like farmer features, only they were dealer features. And I think your dealer features now are a little better than what we were doing then. But back then, we were filling a new need and a new niche.
So you saw really rapid change in the 80s, and also the turmoil that was associated with the ag depression of the 80s at the same time. Must have been a fascinating time to be a scribe in this industry.
It was interesting because the dealers, part of the job, you go to a NAIDA meeting or something, and part of the job of the dealers is There are dealers that were businessmen. There were gearhead guys who became dealers, and business was hard. You know that. That's true in any industry. And they were really struggling back in that time. Some of them got caught with their pants around their ankles on floor planning. I tell this story and people forget this. And what we went through in 86 and 87, going up to the drought of 88 when things turned around, it took 3 more years to work that used equipment inventory out of the system because they flooded. Back in the day, companies flooded the pipeline of equipment because remember, the sale's a sale when it leaves the dock. Well, back then there were different management philosophies. I think it's one of the reasons IH got sucked out of the farm equipment business because they screwed up on that kind of thing back in the old IH days is one of those stories. But every company did this. They pumped the dealer line and then dealers were stuck with all this equipment and eventually the floor planning came due and that was really painful. But then we had all this equipment out there that we had to work through. I think we got through it I've talked to different industry people over time, then they will admit 90, 91, they mostly got that stuff worked back out. We were, when I look at the AEM report now, I try to count inventory and months. And I'm fine with 6 months, but I see things start creeping up 8, 9, 10 months. I think it's a little scary. Well, it was 12, 15, 18 months or more on those reports, those flash reports back in the 80s. And it's amazing that we got out of it alive. And so there were dealer consolidations. There would be 4 or 5 dealers that would figure out that, and now they all know this, but there were 4, some did and some didn't back then. It's like, wait a minute, if the 5 of us get together, we can consolidate our captive parts, cut our tied up money in captive parts into one location that we can deliver to the dealership within 2 hours. So I don't need 6 1480 axles for an IH combine, or I don't need, that 4210 gearbox that's only on that tractor, pick your number. We've got one of them and we can get it to them if we need it. And those were the kinds of things that everybody's a lot smarter about that now. And then over time, though, how that evolved was pretty interesting.
I was interested in what you just described, Willie, about the mid 80s, because I had two people. One was my good friend, Jim Rank, who was very proud of when you guys overtook Implement Tractor. And then Leo Johnson, who we both know from Johnson Tractor, told me that as a kid, Implement Tractor was the magazine.
Yep.
And Farm Equipment unseated it to be the industry leader. And I was curious as to how that came together and how you at Johnson Hill made that happen and celebrated it the day. Then did you know when you guys had become the top influencer on?
I'm not sure we ever exactly knew. I mean, Jim probably knew the minute. That's who Jim was. One of the things that was interesting about Farm Equipment was it had a really strong sales team. Jim Rank's amazing. I mean, I haven't seen him in years, but what a sweet guy, an incredible guy. But man, he wasn't going to miss a sale. I mean, he had all his guys, his friends, and the names he called them, I will not repeat here. Positive, but not named in public. What's that? Potlickers. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, it's little potlickers. He was always dealing with. But you get with a Marlon Cohn from Case Discs and people like that who knew that we were delivering the demographic. The other thing about Farm Equipment versus INT was Farm Equipment was a tabloid, a large format. So we could do big things. We did big things, ran pictures bigger and did stuff that made it more graphically interesting. I think there was a combination of, they had a really solid sales team. Phil Merrick was there at the time. He's passed away. Jim Rank, good sales guys, really beating the bushes, getting to know the market, and already knew a lot of the people in the market because Farm Equipment was around a while. Adding content that was actually more relevant than just new products. And we never dropped the new products. We would always have a section. We'd always have every month, there'd be 2 or 3 sections, but we always got into the timing. We were not running. I love companies, but if you, Toro, just listen, Toro, if you're making snowblowers and you have a new snowblower, Farm Equipment needs to know about that in February so they can run it in May so you can sell it in December. Well, that's still a problem. I mean, when I was at Farm Progress, I get these really nice things in May. Are you going to write about planters? It's going, In May? No, it's in the planter thing last December. So we can write about it in February because that's when we really talk about, and those are the funny things that would come. We'd laugh. I mean, this is true from all the other books that got new product releases. Us editors sit around and go, look at that. We just got this press release. It looks really good, but we wrote about that last month, and it's that kind of fun stuff. But making it relevant and then adding these interviews and stories about the industry or trends in the industry. Those were things that combine that with the new products that everybody was comfortable with, the good solid sales team, and eventually we basically ate their lunch. We just basically threw away the bag. Got a new one.